Let's talk a little bit about what's happening in Ukraine now, um, because we have had a bit of an escalation. There were 8 ATACMS missiles that were fired into the Belgorod region, and there was also a Kursk offensive by
Yeah.
the Ukrainians. So, can you just tell us a little bit about these? Are these connected? What's
Well,
going
they
on
may
there?
be, but it's not clear at this point. The eight ATACMs, apparently all eight of them were shot down, and so it's just another pathetic attempt. Again, the Russians have said that they're going to retaliate, but I think the fact that this attack didn't do any damage apparently means that the pressure to retaliate isn't very strong. And again, Donald Trump will be coming into office in just about 2 weeks' time. So I think the Russians have a very powerful incentive to limit their retaliation. So I don't expect to see anything major at this point. I just stop and think. I think this may be the fourth ATACMS attack. Since the restrictions were lifted, and they've just essentially done nothing. I mean, I think it's embarrassing. It should be embarrassing to Western leaders. Think of all these leaders that were just sort of chanting, let them fire those ATACMS. Constant refrain. You just heard it again and again. It was just like this is going to make the difference. Let's stop holding back the Ukrainians. They can't fight with one hand tied behind the back. You got to let them, uh, even Keir Starmer actually flew to Washington, D.C. and so on. So say, are you guys embarrassed now? You should be. They probably aren't, because they don't even really think about the consequences of their own actions. They're probably just thinking about the next escalation, but they should be just, thoroughly discredited by this.
Mhm.
And in the Pentagon, that was always against this. I think they probably knew, hey, this is going to do virtually nothing and is very risky because it's going to invite Russian retaliation.
Right. It is embarrassing, and we keep on doing it. I think each one of these ATACMS missiles, I believe, cost $2 million.
And
They're
we
from
don't
my
have very many of them. That's the thing, is we're not even producing them at this point. This is a stockpile. I think maybe we stopped producing them in the early 2000s. And we had a stockpile of maybe a couple of thousand or 2,500. What I understand is that we gave 500 to Ukraine. This was when they were using them against the Donbass and Crimea, before the pre-2014 restriction was lifted. And according to a New York Times article, Ukraine was down to 50, when they began firing into Russian territory back in November. So I can't remember what exactly it is, but we're probably down to, if they haven't brought in more and that New York Times story was correct, we should be down to about 25 right now. And
well,
those
why
first
have
25
we?
did nothing.
Right. Yeah. No, it's pathetic. It's like you said, it's embarrassing. It's pathetic. It makes the U.S. military, look impotent, primitive, and
Yeah.
crude.
Well, of course,
Even
they don't advertise this. Like when nothing happens, they just don't report the story when they're all shot down. If something gets through, then they play it up. But
right.
yeah,
It's true. Well, I've been, like I said, I try to follow just mainstream news for about an hour or 30 minutes to an hour a day, just to try to catch the news stories. And I've been noticing that they have not been talking about Ukraine and Russia so much anymore. It's just kind of fading out of the news, which I guess means that it's just because it's all bad news.
I
So they
think
just
that's
don't
right.
talk. They just don't talk about it. It's
Right.
well, like you said, there's been four essentially volleys with ATACMS
Hmm.
and Storm Shadows. That is this.
Yeah. Well, there was
But
also one. There was one that was a combination of Storm Shadows and Attackums, I believe, or maybe Storm Shadow, and that did some damage. It was to some, I think, a depot in the Kursk region, and so a few personnel were killed, but it was not really significant damage.
right. So, anyways, this is a clear red line that Putin said don't do this. And
Right.
when they first did it, he used the Oreshnik. But
Right.
since then, we haven't really seen Putin do anything like the Orushnik. Obviously he hasn't used it again.
Yeah.
There were some things that we considered, could this be the retaliation where they did, large strikes on, energy infrastructure and I think you said it was an SBU headquarters or
right. And then, well, there was also that strike, we discussed, I had my theory on it, that they took out, I think, 4 or 5 HIMARS launchers that are used to launch the ATACMS. And then they also killed a large number of Western personnel, particularly U.S. personnel in a couple of strikes, I believe in southern Ukraine. But we haven't really seen, since the Orushnik, those are all kind of doubtful. It's not clear. It seems to me that those are strikes that would have occurred anyway, with the exception of the Orushnik one. And I think the reason is that the upcoming change of administrations. Trump came out and said that he thought this whole thing, the lifting of the restrictions was stupid. And, he wanted to end it. And I think the Russians heard that. And he may have communicated some message to them through back channels, too. It's like maybe he said, when I come into office, this will end. And knowing that, there's really their incentive to retaliate is greatly reduced.
Right.
So I think they're waiting. Now, if Trump comes into office and nothing changes, the strikes continue, then I think we can see some major retaliations from the Russians. But at this point, they're trying to hold off, wait and see. They have reason to be hopeful that in this case, there will be a change of policy.
Well, that's a great first start, though, in starting to, if Trump holds to his word and ends it, when he gets into office right away. Because then we start have a little basis of just the tiniest little bit of trust being, regained by the Russians.
Step,
And so do you think that's quite promising? We had a long discussion last week about whether or not Trump could end this Ukraine conflict. And we kind of walked away saying that, no, he can't. Because first of all, is that trust that we might have that one little baby step, but the trust won't be there. Right. They know that if a new administration comes in place, they'll just tear up another agreement. I mean, every kind of agreement that we've had with Russia, we just tear up, or we've openly said it's a ruse, like Merkel openly stating publicly, we were just tricking the Russians so we could pump more weapons into Ukraine and take them on. So it's not going to happen, or not a peace deal that I think Trump can walk away saying that he negotiated some type of victory for the U.S. or the West.
The problem again is like I've said, and Mark Sloboda has pointed out, is that we are a party to this conflict. We like to pretend like somehow we're above it and we can impose a solution on both sides, but we're a party to it, and we're a party on the losing side. And so effectively, if we negotiate some sort of treaty, it's going to be a kind of a surrender, and that's just something that the U.S. cannot do. It should have just avoided this entirely, by reaching an agreement through the Minsk Accords or the Istanbul Agreement, and just avoided all of this. But we've very foolishly went full steam ahead, and now we see the consequences. Now we just can't back. If anything that we negotiate is going to be essentially a surrender. We're going to have to cede lots of territories and also accept the Russian demands on neutrality and so forth. That could have been done, earlier. It could have at really very little cost. But now the cost is so great that I don't see it happening. It's not possible.
You're right. When you say that we have to cede lots of territory, I think you're almost kind of, that might be the framework that our leaders view it at. This isn't our territory.
You're right.
That's what's crazy. But do you think that that's how people like Starmer and, the Blinken and Jake Sullivan, they view this as now part of the U.S. empire territory, and them losing it is just too painful? Is that what they view it that way?
I think it is in part. And it's just any kind of victory to the Russians, especially one that where we're the other side, is just, it may not, literally, it's not literally our territory, but it would be our loss. That's because we were so heavily involved in this.
So I know we've talked about this before, but I just thinking how this war is going to end. The more that we discuss this and go into it, I just don't really see it ending now in a way that if we can't achieve a peace deal, if we don't accept that these four Eastern oblasts will be part of Russia, then what are we going to see? I just don't think a sustainable peace with Russia is even possible.
Yeah,
Like,
no, it's actually it's very yeah. I don't think that there is ever going to be a treaty. It's clear that Putin really wanted to have some sort of treaty, some sort of general agreement, to create a new security architecture, as he put it, in Europe. But that's just not going to happen. It's he's accepted it. I think again, it's just that we can't trust these people, and they simply do want to destroy us. And the other side just can't admit failure, even though clearly they are failing. So it's just going to go until the Russians say, well, I think we've taken enough of Ukraine, enough to, um, to provide us with the security that we need. They'll leave a dysfunctional, I believe, I know some people think that they may go all the way to the Polish border. I don't think they will. I think they'll leave a dysfunctional rump state, and they'll take one thing that's actually it needs to be pointed out right now. We've talked about how in the Donbass they've been punching through these fortifications. Actually, that phase of the battle, a very important phase that really started at the end of 2022 with the capture of Marinka, and then was followed by Avdiivka. Was this conquest, this overcoming of the Ukrainian fortifications that had been built up over a decade. There's this belt of fortifications in the Donbass, and the Russians are now coming to the very, very end of that. And that'll be an important phase of the war. Okay, for obviously it has great military significance, but it also is kind of important to understand that area is very valuable, has great economic value. It's actually in a lot of ways it's the most valuable part of Ukraine. It's you notice in a lot of these battles that many of the fights actually take place around mines. It's a mining area. There's a great deal of mineral wealth in that part of Ukraine. And just very recently, I believe the Russians took a major lithium deposit. And lithium, of course, is extremely valuable mineral. It's used in battery technology, which of course has become extremely important. And that's something that Ukraine is losing. It was something that Russia was willing to see. This is your territory. Just be neutral and respect the Russian speakers on your land, and they wouldn't do that. Now they've lost all that. And so anyway, that rump state that Ukraine will probably be left with is going to be the poorest part of Ukraine. It's going to be, it doesn't have the best agricultural lands, and it doesn't have the mineral wealth. It doesn't have the industry. That really all is in the east. And then it doesn't have the coast, the access to the Black Sea, which is, where Odessa and Nikolaev are located. And I think it's very, very likely that the Russians will take that area in the south as well. Again, because it's actually, it's Russian speaking. The people there lean strongly towards Russia.
Right, but this rump state, will it just essentially become a NATO outpost, though, where NATO will just pump in?
Yeah, well, that's the danger. It really is, of course.
Russia won't allow that, though, right? I mean, that's what started this whole thing to begin with.
Right. Yeah. Well, they just may make a decision. I don't know what. Yeah, I don't know, but they just may make a decision that they've had enough. That whatever's there is is essentially neutralized and surrounded? I don't know. That's a really difficult question. I don't know what the answer is to that. I don't know if the Russians know either. I think they just know that they have to keep on pressing forward and see what happens.
Right, especially while they have the momentum and the advantage.
Right.
You don't want to give the enemy a reprieve to sort of understand all the mistakes, although I don't know if we're capable of learning from our mistakes. So far, it seems like we haven't. But to rebuild forces, sort of reindustrialize the military-industrial complex. But the West is in such a bad spot. I don't even think they're capable of reindustrializing because they cut off all the energy, all the gas. Like, how you expect to start turning on your war machine when you can't even keep the lights on now?
Right.
Commercially and residentially.
Yeah, certainly Europe, is it's just pathetic. The U.S. potentially certainly could. The U.S. still does have a lot of cheap energy, and we'll see. I mean, it's not like, but it's going to take a real change of policy and an awakening, and it just to reality. I think it's just, again, the elites here are just so comfortable with the way things are. It's been the current arrangements are so lucrative that they just don't have the incentives to change. So we'll continue to have this kind of very bloated and inefficient and ineffective military-industrial complex into the foreseeable future. If there was a real awakening and say, hey, we look, they're outproducing us, we need to rebuild our industry. You can make a decision now, but it would take years, maybe even decades to get back to where really, because these are, you need the workers, the facilities, the supply chains. There's a whole kind of ecology that has to be reestablished. It's not just a matter of building a couple of factories. It's a whole network, a system, an ecosystem of factories that you have to build up. And that takes like a generation to do.
Right. Talking about maybe 20, 30 years. I mean, because we've outsourced it all to China. I mean, that's why China is a manufacturing belt. It's the agglomeration of industries that are there to create that type of logistics manufacturing belt. And we can't recreate that overnight. It's going to take a long, long time. Yeah. It's when I think about it, I feel like that we're at the stage that this war may just keep on going and Russia will continue just to grind forward. And the West has decided that this is the hill that they're going to die on. And it might end with the collapse of the American empire, with the collapse of NATO, something like that. Do you believe that's true, that we will die on this hill? And
we very well could. I mean, it's just, I think we are deeply invested in it, much more so than in some of the other wars like Afghanistan, that we walked away from. We've walked away from a lot of wars. In the end, again, the U.S. could walk away from this war, like I've said, and it obviously would be a blow to U.S. prestige. It would be a real shock, but we could walk away from it and not suffer very serious consequences. But of course, it's Europe that's really suffering. It is already suffering from this. It's suffering not, directly because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but of their own policies, that their response to this, exactly, that they've done at the bidding of the United States. But you have to say, again, it's been willing. It's not like they're taking orders and carrying it out. It's just like they've really been brainwashed, and they've just kind of, so you have a lot of leaders that are really committed to this course, this very self-destructive course.
So what do you think is more likely, that the U.S. will eventually walk away and then have to sort of hang its head in shame, be a big black mark on Trump's presidency, or that we're going to try to keep support in some form or fashion and it's just going to grind on? But it's just going to keep on grinding on until there's going to be a collapse. I mean, we're coming close to a collapse. That's the thing. It's just like, how much can... pumping weapons in doesn't seem to be doing a lot of good for Ukraine. We finally got them those ATACMS that they were wanting, they're fighting with one arm behind their back, and we untied it and they pulled out the other arm, and it's just
you think about it,
It's
kind of interesting. I mean, it's not just this, but that's been the story all along. It's the introduction of new weapons. Or another thing was remember the $61 billion package for Ukraine. And it was, the Republicans were holding out on that. And then there was all this hue and cry. It's like, we're depriving the Ukrainians of the much needed arms. That's why they're starting to to lose. That's when Avdiivka, for example, fell, and it was a lot of the blame was placed on the Republicans, and then eventually, of course, with Trump's support, we have to remember, the package was passed, and the Ukrainians started to get this infusion of new funds and new weapons. It didn't make a bit of difference. Just look at the course of 2024, and it's actually after Avdiivka, the Russian advances accelerated. You would think that if this was really important, it was going to make a difference. You would see something like you would see a graph. Okay, this is when the new arms were introduced, and the Russians slowed, significantly slowed their advance at that point. That did not happen. The advances accelerated through 2024. It did nothing. So that's just been the story all along, and there's going to be more of these. You just be sure of it. You're going to hear about some new weapon system or some new aid package that's going to turn the tide, that's going to make all the difference, and it will fail, and they'll forget that it failed, and then it'll be something else. I kind of see, it just going on and on. I think it's going to be really hard. I think Trump actually, and some people in his administration, some, not all, not by a long shot, really do want to just walk away from this, but I think they're going to find it impossible to do. You just don't want to be the president that lost the war. But I don't know. I really don't know. It's where we put ourselves kind of like, again, between a rock and a hard place. There's just no good solution for the U.S. It's going to be hard for the Russians. It's like they're going to win, but like, again, I've said many times, an ugly victory. It's not going to be fully satisfying, whatever happens. But it's worse for the U.S. They're going to lose, and it's just sort of a question of how ugly that loss is going to be. And I don't. That's a tough one. I don't know how they're going to deal with it. It just may go on and on and on, like you say. It's really quite unfortunately. Maybe there just has to be a coup within Ukraine or something. I don't know.
Yeah, Ukraine has turned into this bottomless pit that the West is just constantly throwing money down, Ukrainian lives down, and military equipment down, and it's just gobbling everything up. Do you think at some point that bottomless pit will just swallow the U.S. empire? We keep on throwing. You can't do it forever, right? There's a limit. Our debt is over $36 trillion. Our military is exposed. Apparently, we got problems around the whole world. Our vassal states. We got the Middle East.
It's obviously South Korea. Right. It's obviously a strain on the U.S. empire. I think if you look at the amount of money spent, it's significant, but it's still just a small percentage of how much the U.S. spends on various things, every year. The problem really is the armaments. It's just that because of Ukraine, we've drawn down our stockpiles. We're just talking about the ATACMS. We had a stockpile of ATACMS, and apparently, they're actually a very important part of our military and of a foreseen conflict, for example, in East Asia. The Pentagon has made it clear that we have to keep a certain number of ATACMS for that, and I think we're probably coming to for them what is the bare minimum. Yeah, and that's what's happening on with respect to many kinds of armaments, especially air defense missiles. That those stockpiles are long gone, and again, Israel is in first in line. They're getting it, and there's just very little to go around it for anybody else, including for the U.S. itself and NATO itself. That's a hard reality that they've come up against, and I don't know how they're going to deal. At this point, they're just drawing a certain amount from monthly production and giving a certain percentage to Ukraine. But it clearly isn't enough. So, there'll always be talk that we need to do more, but there really is nothing more that we can do.
Yeah, you mentioned that the ATACMS are no longer in production. I also heard that.
Yeah.
But why are they no longer in production? If there's an important part of our armament, then clearly it's a problem. If you stop producing them, then you don't think they're that important, right?
Yeah, well, we made a lot of them, apparently. I mean, it's just like this. it's clear that we weren't really preparing for a real war with a peer adversary. And that all these very expensive weapon systems, and some of these weapons are fairly effective, but they're all very expensive. And that was almost the point. He said we make expensive things. The more expensive it is, the better for everybody concerned. That's the way they think about it. It wasn't, okay, look, we may be in a war in 10 years and we must have these things. That's the stated justification. Whenever like the Pentagon rolls out a budget and, its budget requests, it's, say, well, we have these warfighting needs. But I think the reality that everybody knows, because we haven't fought a real war with a peer adversary in such a long time, that it's become this game, again, where the lobbyists and the congressmen and and above all, the arms manufacturers make huge amounts of money. And that game is just going to continue. It was, so yeah, ATACMS were made and a lot of people made a lot of money off of it. If they were really thinking about a war with a peer adversary, they wouldn't have stopped production. But it was probably somebody came along with a new weapon system that had an even higher price tag. So clearly, hey, ATACMS is kind of boring. Now this is actually the profit on this is getting lower and lower. Let's introduce something new. We'll attach a lot of bells and whistles to it. It's probably no better than the ATACMS, but it's going to be 3 times as expensive and we'll be 3 times as rich.
Okay, yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking.
That's very cynical, but I think that's the reality. Right. I don't think anybody can deny that.
I mean, I was thinking the only reason that you would stop making the ATACMS is because you have something new and improved. Like you're not making the iPhone 4 anymore. We're on, I don't even know what iPhone we're on, but anyways, we're on the newest one.
We're way past that, right?
Right. So that's why we're not making these anymore. But then I haven't seen the replacement, so to speak, of the ATACMS, if there is one. What is it? And why would they not give them to Ukraine? And, part of what you said makes sense is that if they did upgrade it, first of all, who knows how effective it really is, if it really is a big improvement. And then, like you said, that it's going to cost a lot more money. And I'm sure the production levels are going to be even lower. Instead they roll out like those SM-3 interceptors, the Navy interceptors. You told me that they only produce 12 a year.
Right.
And there was that volley from, I know, was it from the Iranian attack? They fired 12.
The last one. I think they fired 12. All
12. They didn't hit a single thing, right? I don't think they intercept a single thing.
You got to wait till next year, right?
Right. That was a whole year's supply of production. So this whole thing is, that's like we're saying that. So this Ukraine is this pit, and okay, maybe we can, because we have the printing press, we can throw money down there for a long time. Eventually, it will break our economy, but we can keep on chucking money. But we can't keep on chucking armaments down there because we just can't make them anymore, and we're getting desperate for them, and we can't keep on chucking lives down there because the most horrific part of this whole conflict is that we're running out of Ukrainian lives to throw down there. So that's why they are wanting to lower the conscription age to 1825, because there's not enough people above the age of 25 that are left to fight this war. And then you put in the age of 1825. You basically have sacrificed the whole future of Ukraine. I mean, how are you going to have a future generation? These are the people that are your future. They are the ones that are going to have kids. Right. And I'm sure a lot of people aren't having children in Ukraine just because of the conflict that's going on. It's not really conducive to that type of environment. You're going to essentially lose. Ukraine has no future now. Right. That's what it is. That's really
true. I mean, it's the demographic future is very bleak. I think we're looking at the end of Ukraine in a few generations. Essentially what happened in Ukraine is the 1990s never stopped. Russia suffered a horrible decade, a disastrous decade, in the 1990s. And their, fertility rates plummeted. Their mortality rates skyrocketed, especially among men. But starting, around 2000, which was right after when Putin took office, things have steadily improved in Russia. And, again, your sister has been a witness to this. She went there 10 years ago, 12 years ago, and then, made other trips. And every time she visited Russia, she could see things were getting better. There just was and they continue to improve, to this very day, even through the war. But that never happened in Ukraine. It's just like the corrupt government, the oligarchs, they never went away, and the 1990s just continued to fester. And so, yeah, fertility rates have remained very low. And what you find is like, there's a healthy number of 50-year-olds, but very few 18-year-olds. And that was one reason, I think maybe the main reason, that the Ukrainian government was reluctant to conscript young men, is that they know that demographic is particularly meager. There just aren't very many of those Ukrainians left. And yeah, you by conscripting them, sending them to the front, and where many of them are going to die, you are putting the future of Ukraine at risk. I think you have to say even more than at risk. You really are kind of
extinguishing it.
Yeah, choosing to extinguish Ukraine, right?
Sad. It's awful.
Yeah, no, it really is. It's a horror story.
I think, we talk about this conflict not being able to end, with a treaty, with a negotiation that it might kind of grind on, which just means that there will be more and more lives lost, more and more armaments. Eventually will come to an end when there's nothing left to throw into this pit. But a lot of it, I think, at the end of the day, stems from this demonization of Russia that will keep it going, that we have demonized it. And it's just something that's been part of the U.S. DNA almost for 80 years, and not the Western European DNA as well. That there's just this visceral hatred and fear of Russia. And I just think that will always, as long as that's there will be that base that we can add fire to continue throwing Ukrainian lives and the U.S. empire down this Ukrainian bottomless pit. Is there any way that we can end that demonization? Like, this type of stuff, right. That's the root of the problem.
Right.
We ought to be able to look at Russia as not just evil,
Yeah. There are hopeful signs. We've spoken about the rise of certain political parties in Europe, both Western and Eastern. But we've also spoken about the establishment's authoritarian and very anti-democratic reaction to the rise of these parties. But it may eventually, one may break through, and it appears that that's about to happen in Austria. I believe it's the Freedom Party in Austria, which it's called far right. Again, far right probably, what they call far right would not have been called far right earlier in my day. Like their position, which is important for what we're talking about here on the Ukraine conflict, is that we should remain neutral, and we should end support for Ukraine, and promote a peaceful solution. So this apparently is far right. That used to be sort of what leftists said, when I was young. But anyway, now somehow it's called far right. But so that's hopeful. If the Freedom Party takes power in Austria, then we have Orban's Hungary, we have Fico's Slovakia, and then we'd have a third country, a very important country, Austria, actually in Western Europe. And maybe Italy, too, could flip. I've talked about the public sentiment. It's very, very strong against supporting Ukraine there. So, again, there is reason to be somewhat hopeful within Europe.